Hi, Nancy Stepp. That big boisterous bear of a man is my pastor at Good Shepherd. Quick question, the mission training, whatever it's called, was it only Lutheran pastors or was it pastors from all over? I'm assuming all over because of your learning communities?
To the best of my knowledge, it was only Missouri Synod Lutheran pastors, but I don't know that for a fact. But most of the men and their wives that I got to know were Missouri Synod pastors. There were a few of us that graduated together. There were others who had, come from had been a pastor already, and then the district said, "Hey, we'd like you to plant a church. We're going to send you to some training." So, but for the most part, the training itself for MPI was Missouri Synod.
And is that related to or connected with PLI at all?
Somebody else asked me that question earlier, and I do not know the answer to that. I do know that some of the names that I've seen over the years that have been on the board or the support team or the various phrases they use for that, some of those names have been similar between the various organizations. So if you go to the Center for U.S. Missions, I didn't get to talk too much about that, but you can go to their website now. They are not an RSO. I think they used to be an RSO, but I couldn't find when that was. I know when we first went, they told us they were an RSO, but I didn't have Lutheran Annuals going back that far, and you can't get those statistics online, unfortunately. So Center for U.S. Missions, they still do a lot of the same mission training. It's changed a little bit. So.
Thank you for your presentation. That sounded really interesting. Do they still offer that training?
Want to go to California with me?
I'm just kidding. It's kind of related to Pastor Poppy's question of my dad. And when you said, I think it wasn't in the manuscript, but you're in fellowship with that. And am I in fellowship? Is it possible for a Christian to be in fellowship with false doctrine or false practice? So like if I say there's a church that practices open communion, and I don't commune at that church, and I warn my parishioners not to commune at that church, and if people come from a church that practices open communion, I tell them you can't commune here, that seems to me like I'm not in fellowship with that. Now, outwardly, I suppose, everybody's like, well, the synod, and then you got to go through these proper rules. Well, they're the ones who are breaking fellowship with me. And the fact that the leadership, or there hasn't been anything done synodically, is quite beside the point, isn't it? And so I guess it's kind of a caution that we learn not to speak that way, but instead say, they're not in fellowship with us. And I kind of encourage that, but I also would like to know, what, and maybe just bring this up for discussion at the ACELC, which is what we do, like how do we practice this? Because we can't, what fellowship has light with darkness? Have nothing to do with these works of darkness, but expose them. And even though we're in a synod, that doesn't mean that we are automatically in fellowship, even if the synod is supposed to be that. If you can comment on that or argue or something like that, I don't know. I want some clarity.
That is a valid and excellent question, first of all, and I thank you for asking it. The first point I would address would be, and this is what we would need to do, would be to define then the nomenclature. So how do you define fellowship? If you define it in a narrow sense, and I would take you back, or anybody that's listening or anybody that wants to learn more about it, go back to our ACELC conference on communion. All right, so what did Walther say? Communion is our banner, right? So fellowship then in a narrow sense would be just with those with whom you what? You commune. Is that a fair definition on my part?
I don't think so. Those with you, practically speaking, but you commune with those who, where the gospel is purely preached and the sacraments are rightly administered, and who aren't living in open sin, etc. So I wouldn't bring it to, that's like almost like the narrow sense, like it encompasses more. Do you see, like it involves, because there can't be communion without preaching. Correct. So I would hesitate to just to put it just to one. I agree that is the telltale of it, right. But.
So the second part that I would say, and let's continue this later. I'd love to talk more and perhaps even learn from you a little bit on that. But will you take the wider sense of it then? How have we as the Missouri Synod defined, and this is a different question, fellowship? That would be then synodical membership. Is that fair? Anybody raise their hand if I'm off base on that? Synodical membership either by the pastor, the worker, or the congregation. So I will say this, I got a little heated there in my paper. I didn't actually write that phrase in my paper, okay? So forgive my zeal in that sense. But in terms of what we are in fellowship with, if you are in the Missouri Synod, you are the member of a Missouri Synod church, you support the Missouri Synod in various ways, whether it's dollars or otherwise, there is a larger fellowship there that you are a part of. You just are. Now, is that to be understood just in the narrow sense? No.
Well, is that real?
Have they broken fellowship with us? Yes, they have.
Okay, setting aside the broad or narrow, I would ask, is that really biblical fellowship? As we speak of,
I like that question.
Is it actually?
I mean, what you're asking is the Synod biblical?
Well, it's obviously
no, I mean
not.
It is.
But
that's what you're driving at. And I think what I've been studying in terms of church structure and governance has really led me down some interesting rabbit holes. And I don't have the answer for those, but I think the way we have defined church is backwards in some respects. And I think your question about fellowship is valid and should be given more thought and discussion. Fair enough? Okay.
I was going to ask you, what is incarnational living? But
I gave you the book reference there, Rolf. You can read it.
Okay. Do I have to?
Mark and avoid for the rest of you people. I had a lot of books I was looking for when I was writing this paper that I realized I threw away. I mean, seriously, so.
Well, I'll just throw this out, just based on your conversation with Mark here. Let's say that you are a public school teacher, and you're a Christian, and you're kind of a conservative, and you live in Minnesota, and you're not going to get a job unless you join the Minnesota Education Association, which is a labor union.
I'm tracking.
And so you got to do that to get the job. So let's say you are an Orthodox confessional Lutheran pastor, and you want to serve Lutherans. Well, the Missouri Synod, when they certify you, that's kind of like the MEA membership. So you kind of have to belong. Otherwise, you can't be a pastor unless you want to serve some, unaffiliated church, and you know how they can be. So do you think, I know I'm talking kind of cynically here, but do you think this is maybe the way a lot of folks look at it these days, that, hey, it's really the only game in town, but we aren't necessarily in fellowship with everybody who's in this synod?
Yes, I think many people do look at it that way.
Hate to hijack this whole thing, but Pastor Freeman, Peace Lutheran Church, Chehalis, Washington. I hate to hijack this whole thing, but this conversation, at the Synod Convention 2 weeks ago, we voted to enter into fellowship with 3 different partner church bodies. One of them, there was some significant conversation on the convention floor about. And President Rast of the Fort Wayne Seminary came to the microphone. He was on that particular floor committee. And he said, understand that our vote does not establish fellowship. The fellowship is in the doctrine and the practice. It already exists. We are recognizing that the fellowship exists. I'm thinking maybe we have an opposite corollary. We have not yet recognized with parishes within the Missouri Synod that fellowship no longer exists. We haven't recognized it, but it doesn't.
So Mark, in that sense, then I would take back that comment, that you're in fellowship with that, as I said. That was not what I meant by that. Okay, obviously by your confession and practice. But in terms of church structure, right, that's a different beast. So
we go by this definition that is the official rules, and we get farther and farther away from what the Bible actually says about it. And it's like, would you say that you're in fellowship with women lectors, with the practice of women defying the order of creation and speaking publicly to the assembly gathered in God's name? Are you personally, don't you teach against that? How could you be in fellowship with something that you teach against? Do you see what I mean? And anyway, I got into this big, long, almost worthless Facebook argument.
Oh, surprising.
with a sectarian in Denmark. Oh yeah, we all. Hi, I'm Mark, and I'm a Facebook argument addict. Sorry. But he's pointing out this is very interesting, and I had a conversation about this at the Bugenhagen conference last week with a bunch of pastors. Which all you pastors, the Bugenhagen conference is like the best winkle you can go to. It's an amazing experience, very experiential. Heath Curtis was there, and he brought up, and this has been something that David Kind had brought to my attention when I was still in college, is that Leo sent a delegate to, like a deacon, to a synod. It wasn't a major synod, but it was a gathering, and they had a communion service before they resolved the issue. Now, they ended up resolving the issue so that they were in agreement, but the deacon communed at the service before the issue was resolved, and Leo disciplined him for it. And I think that it's these kinds of things that if we look at how our fathers have dealt with this. He brought up another thing with John Gerhardt, and I forgot to ask him for the source. But the question was, they would have people who would live at one, like these lords would live on this estate and then on this estate. And that question was, should this person commune at this other church when he's there, and then commune at this church when he's there? And John Gerhardt said, by no means, because he's not his pastor. So there were very strict things that they did, even when they were in agreement with each other, that I think might help us if we just go back to the bare essentials of what fellowship is and what communion is. And I don't claim to have all the answers, but just that kind of side comment, I've been hearing this, and I've said this. I mean, I used to say that, hey, now we're in fellowship with, because we're in fellowship with church bodies that are in fellowship with the LWF, the Lutheran World Federation, which is entirely un-Lutheran. And then so it's like, oh, are we in fellowship with them? It's kind of like the sex education version of fellowship. Well, if you've been with this person, then you've been with all of these other people, and it's like, that's kind of how it is.
Could I interrupt you and ask you a question?
Yeah, please
Could you write
me.
a paper on all that for next year's conference?
Thank you very much.
I will mention one thing that I didn't mention in the paper. The Missouri Synod has come out with a new model kind of, I don't want to use the term method because it really doesn't go that way. Reverend Dr. Steve Schaub has written that. You can go to the LCMS website. It's like 80, 90 pages and talks about church planning and what it is. And I've worked my way through about the first half of it, and it's pretty good. So check it out. He takes it where we need to take it. So, okay? Yeah, next question.
Pastor Benjamin Siebert and Lucas from Lincoln, Kansas. In your work on structure and governance, with the pressure from the outside to attempt to evangelize as non-Lutherans, and perhaps to organize ourselves according to business models at times, that pressure. Have you noticed anything, have you noticed a tendency that those come together? Or is this somewhat a separate pressure as congregations organize themselves?
A tendency to bring the congregation together?
No, these two pressures toward non-Lutheran evangelism practice and non-traditionally Lutheran forms of organizing?
Well, I think as was mentioned earlier, right, so you've got, there's a whole list of influences we've had upon our church body and all of American Christianity, Don Abden obviously being one of them. But the merging together of that, let me see if I can clarify your question to me. The merging together of the outreach to the non-Christian along with the church as it exists now. Am I getting that right?
Well, the pressure, I came from a church that reorganized itself when I was probably 18. And I didn't like the smell of it at the time, and I was kind of ignorant anyway, but it sounds in retrospect a lot like the Transforming Churches Institute sort of a plot, making the pastor CEO and all this nonsense. When those kinds of things come in, is there also, obviously there's also the evangelical, but with the mission plans, do those things kind of come in together? Is the way that do they organize themselves in I don't think I'm asking a question.
Okay, so the new church plants, you would see, and you still to this day see the organizational model that is preferred by usually it's the planting pastor or the core group of people that started with, okay? So I have become more of a traditionalist in terms of what most people here would know as the voters, councils, boards, committee type of structure, where the power of all major decisions, certainly of calling, is rested within the voters. And so the influence on not just policy-based government is a little bit of a newer thing, and you don't really have a Missouri Synod Church that is truly policy-based. You have hybrid models that are part of that. Most of our more liberal or contemporary churches operate more on what would be called an executive board model, where the power is structured within this executive board. So my father's a member at Christ Lutheran down in Overland Park, Kansas. He called me actually as I was driving out here on yesterday and said, hey, we've got some real issues in the parish right now, running behind on money. Money's, seems to have been misspent in various ways, but, what can I do about it? And I said, well, certainly speak up and address it. He said, no, you don't understand. We have an executive board that makes all the decisions. And so we don't have voters' meetings or anything like that. Well, his only recourse of action is to do what? Get elected or appointed on the board. So what I do not like about structure and governance, whether we're talking about mission plants or how it's organized, is normally it's all about power. It's all about who's going to tell somebody else to do what. It's not Christian in the majority of the cases. So true power and authority should be left with the power and authority that God gives in His Word, whether that's to that of a father in the household, a father and mother over their children, whether that's that of the government in terms of the civil or kingdom of the left, or whether that's the power of those who have been called to feed the sheep. So I have certainly become more of a proponent of, however you want to historically call them, 3 estates, 3 fathers, and authority structure in that way. We've gotten away from organizing ourselves and talking that way, but I digress. Any other questions about mission planning?
This one's not about mission planting.
Or Mission Planners Institute.
Okay, yes. So I just had a quick question on page 11. You were criticizing let's see, what is it? The mission, the Center for U.S. Missions kind of mission statement. And you were mentioning that you said right after that quote, you said God's people should not be the subject of any sentences or emphases. And I'm just curious about how we could, is there a need to nuance that more given the fact that what you propose of feeding the sheep, we're running the verb there, even though God's doing the work through us. Or whenever tying back to yesterday's conversations, when we're out confessing, we're running the verb there, even though it's God working through us. So what would be the line that makes us running the verb here proper and us running the verb here improper?
Sure.
Yeah, does that make sense?
I understand. Thank you for that question. No, God works through means, and I think I interjected that in terms of God using people. So, you know, when a layman says to another, read Scripture, I mean, my goodness, you know, Ralph, we could go to some great direction here in terms of the power of God's Word in the hand of lay people. And that needs to be emphasized because the didymus and the exousia is in the Word, right? However, that for them is secondary. Where did they go in their mission statement? What's primary for them? They start with God's people. You don't start there. So that would be my point, is that you don't start in that sense with talking about what God's people do. You start with what has God done in Jesus Christ. And then obviously you follow where the Augustana goes, you know, what has Christ created in terms of the office? What is the church? I mean, just run through the whole Augustana. It's all laid out for you that way.
Okay, so just to kind of nuance it, it's more about the starting point and our emphasis rather, because I think about the comment that the teacher made yesterday, I forgot her name. But so I think that's maybe a common sentiment is some people leave these discussions feeling like there's no role at all and for the lady. And so maybe to just emphasize the correct starting point or the right emphasis, and then from there kind of branching out and expanding.
We have become so anthropocentric. You know what that means?
Man at the center.
There you go. So we have become so centered, and my brother, Pastor Kuhlman, calls it navel gazing. I've stolen the term. I love it. I don't really like it, but you know what I mean. Navel gazing. That's all about self-justification. It's looking inward. It's you know, the starting place then is what must I do or what can I do, and that's never where you start. So now the Lord desires to work through that, and that's why good works are important. That's why we preach, third use. That's why we admonish, encourage. Absolutely. So I would just say it's a matter of a starting point. I'm sorry if I overemphasize that, but
I have nothing to say about your first part of your paper.
You still go to Valentino's?
No. I will say that, I mean, we've had almost 20 vicars, and Pastor Mackay is the most miraculous transformation from a non-Lutheran guy who was more concerned about his abs than he was doctrine to a hardcore Lutheran. So thanks be to God. Thanks be to God. No, I do seriously have a question. You said after you came back from Mission Planters Institute, you were supposed to get together with some little quasi group.
Learning community.
Learning community.
Learning community was what it was called.
Okay, so in this learning community, you could not be with any other Lutherans. You were supposed to be with non-Lutherans only.
Correct.
You have any speculation why?
That's a great question. Why do you think? I can tell you why.
Well, in my brain and in my heart, I would say they didn't want you around any other Lutherans because they might want to try to talk you out of the nonsense that you had just been fed at the Mission Planters Institute. That's what I want to say. What do you think?
We were taught in this way, that there is truth and good practice to be found outside of the Missouri Synod boundaries. And so go check it out. Go mix it up with some of these other guys. I mean, look at all the text. I mean, and I gave you the documentation for it of what was required reading, right? And all the references that I had in my paper outside of, you know, our confessions and scripture, you know, and mark and avoid, by the way, those are not Lutheran books. But this is where the majority of the material was coming from. You want to know where all these practices have come from? It has not come from the Lutheran Church. It's come from outside of it. Especially, Mark, when you start talking about fellowship. It's different fellowship. Or it's, I said that wrong, didn't I? But you know what I mean. It's false. It's false teaching. So mark it as false teaching. Whereas, what we've been taught in our postmodern age, and I think what has happened at our seminaries and our institutions and our schools, and I've seen that not just from being a student myself, but from having my children in that, is forget about the doctrinally pure use or the approved things, and if you can find something good out of it, then take something good out of it. And so, but in so doing, you now subject your children and your people to all sorts of naughtiness, right? So, I don't know what to compare it to. You like to duck hunt, I know, right? So if I tell you that
Do you like to duck hunt?
I do like to duck hunt. That the best place to shoot ducks would be inside of what are we going to do with this here? A zoo cage full of black bears. And that, if you really want to shoot ducks, you're going to have to go in the middle of this cage with these bears, and you can shoot the ducks as they come over. But what's going to be the problem? And if you're worried about the bears, do snakes, do scorpions, whatever you want to do, right? So yeah, you might get a few ducks. You might get some really good shooting. You might have some of the best tasting green-winged or blue-winged teal that you've ever had, right? Wrapped around bacon and a pepper on the grill. But you're going to have to be exposed to all this other danger. And so, historically, mark and avoid. Don't subject our people to that, and especially our young pastors. And why start a new church in that way?
See, I'm going to look at this from a different perspective. I think this is where the intersection between the Mission Planters Institute and PLI come together. Because after you go to PLI, you are put into an affinity group, which is very similar to how you just described this leadership group. And the mark of this affinity group is you are together with people who are not Lutheran. And in the past, we have had pastors in our winkles who will not come to the winkle. They will go to their affinity group because their winkle is not a safe space. I'm not kidding, folks. Because if they say something not Lutheran at winkle, sometimes a boisterous bear of a pastor might call them on it. And then that's not a safe space. But if they go with their affinity group, where they're not expected to agree in doctrine, but they already agree in method, it becomes an automatic safe space. So I would say with your duck hunting analogy, the grizzly bears in the cage are the other Missouri Synod pastors who might take a bite out of you. And so you want to get into a safe cage where the hardcore Lutheran people aren't going to bite. I think this is something for further investigation on why they don't want these newly catechized mission planters or PLI guys, why they don't want them around other Lutherans. I think there's something there.
I have 3 short things in response to that. Number 1, I love you. Number 2, you're half the man you used to be. And number 3, as has already been pointed out, all of these practices have come out of business models. Before I went into seminary, I had peer review groups. I had, and you go through anybody that's gone through training, whether it's with an airline in various ways, you have. All of this is taken from the business world in various ways. So nowadays, what you need to pay attention to, and this is being done in some districts. I have a good friend of mine, he just was a couple years ahead of me at seminary, Reverend Travis Goosey. I believe he's with the Southeastern District. He is into coaching. So coaching now, and we're not talking about coaching your kid's little league team, okay? So we had a coach at MPI. Mine was Pastor Eisel, and I'm thankful for that because he fell more to the right side than the left. And so we had some good discussions and worked through some things. The whole concept of coaching, of being attached to somebody who then is going to lead and guide you and help you become indoctrinated according to either what the company wants you to be or the organization. And so I can't speak to the connection between PLI and MPI. As far as I know, there's not one, but if you find anything, let me know. But it's very similar tactics. But they all come from the business world or motivational and indoctrination strategy in some way, shape, or form. Pastor Niemeyer.
Thank you, Pastor Mackay. Craig Niemeyer from Zion Worms. Anthropocentric, starting man-centered, navel-gazing, all the different, it's so appealing to my bag of fallen flesh, and it seems easy on the one sense, but that is an incredible burden. I'm curious about church worker retention, if you have any idea. Probably dual, I have my suspicions in terms of the burden that places upon the congregation and then the individual church worker in a day and age where pressures from the outside and the culture and, it's already mounting and we're already, just a regard for our treasure in the church of the church workers and the congregations they serve. Do you have any sense in terms of burnout and retention of clergy in that model? I'll end it with a question mark.
Sure, thank you. I don't have any statistics that I can share with you. I know, and I think you've been through the doxology program. They have put together some statistics just for pastors in general. Has anything been done specifically for mission planting pastors? Not that I'm aware of. Doesn't mean it's not out there. I just haven't come across it. I can tell you from my personal experience that probably half, let's just do it this way. So out of the Mission Planners Institute that I attended, there were 17 of us pastors roughly there, I think, with our wives. And I know that 3 years later, out of those 17 new plants, only 2 or 3 were going. Okay? So what happened to those pastors, I don't know. I do know a few that either left the ministry or, had other issues. There's, planning churches is hard work. It's a lot of work when you're starting from the ground floor. There's a lot of stresses on the family, especially with finances if you're married and have kids. And so that's all part of it. I appreciate that question. I think mission planning is important. It needs to be done in an orthodox fashion. It needs to be done with good resources. So we should do things, with good order. Okay?
I knew a man in Texas who had formed a contract with a congregation that the congregation would grow a certain amount, and if it didn't grow by a certain amount by a certain date, then he would resign. Have you heard? This was...
Yes, I have heard of contracts like that. I've also heard of contracts that are padded with incentives. If you reach a certain membership level, that will also increase salary. And other things like that. So I have come across that. I wouldn't say that's the norm, but that stuff is out there. I had to file, when I got out the first year, I had to file a monthly report. How many visits I made, how many prospects I had. I had to show how the money was used. Some of that, not so bad. It's good to have a little bit of oversight and guidance, but what's the real metric? I think that's the real, or what are the real metrics? And I'm not sure you can always confine the Holy Spirit to our human inventions. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with a failed mission plant. Okay, look at Scripture. It's shake the dust off your feet, and do what? Keep preaching the word, right? So, and look at all the places the seed falls. So, I think really what turned me off on so much of it was just how success was measured.
That concludes our question and answer time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.